It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Simon Clarke, former Shadow Cabinet Minister Valerie Vaz, former Labour MP Caroline Flint and Times columnist Matthew Parris. Today,
I attended a number of meetings of Cabinet at that time and herd immunity was never the declared strategy.
Not at all, no. Absolutely not.
they say it wasn't. Dominic Cummings says it was. We'll find out more from him this week. Labour has a candidate for the next by-election. How badly does the party need to win? The mother of this heroin addict who died aged 32 says drug laws are out of date.
We can't go on like this. You know, drug policies are killing our young people rather than the drugs themselves.
Let's start with this headline in The Times today, which is looking ahead to confidence growing over June the 21st. COVID all clear. That's the date the government has set for a full unlocking, lifting of all restrictions. It's partly dependent on data about the transmissibility of the variant that's originated in India. We're hoping to get that data either towards the end of this week or the beginning of next. It also is true that scrutiny on the government's handling of the pandemic has its first major outing this week when Boris Johnson's former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, gives evidence to two select committees at once on Wednesday. Now, he's been tweeting vociferously ahead of his appearance about what he sees as government failures at the very top. My question, starting with Simon and Valerie, is we're going to hear from him on Wednesday, but should people listen to what he's got to say, Simon?
Well, it's very important we hear from everyone who's been involved in the handling of this crisis, and that's why, obviously, the government has commissioned a full inquiry, which will be reporting in the course of the next couple of years over what has actually happened and the very complex series of choices that the government and indeed governments around the world have had to face since this began.
But he's a key figure. He was there throughout the pandemic at the beginning. So should people listen to what he has to say?
We need to listen to everyone who was involved in this. But what I would say is the government strategy was very clearly to flatten the curve of COVID. That was what was being talked about really exhaustively from last spring onwards. Now, that's certainly what I recollect as being the government strategy, was to make sure that the pressures on the NHS were not such as to overwhelm our healthcare system and make it impossible to save lives. That, I think, is a much truer reflection than to say that the policy was herd immunity. Right,
we are going to hear from him, as we've said, Valerie, but should people take notice and listen to what he has to say?
I think we're very keen to hear from Dominic Cummings, not least because he's refused to appear to the House of Commons committees previously. But yes, it is important because there are a number of questions that people want to ask him about eye tests and Barnard Castle. But the key thing about what he's saying is I remember being in a meeting in committee room, I think it was committee room 14, with Chris Whitty and Matt Hancock. And at the time, they said that they wanted to allow people to attend, I think it was a rugby match, and I think Liverpool fans were going from Spain to Liverpool. They wanted them to attend the match because I remember Chris Whitty saying, and you could call that herd immunity.
Chief Medical Officer, yeah.
Yeah, the Chief Medical Officer. And I heard him saying, he said, well, it's better that they go to the ground than all congregate in the pubs together, because that's what they're going to do. So if that's not herd immunity, I don't know what is, but we're very, very keen to hear from Dominic Cummings.
Well, before I come to Matthew and Caroline, just to tell you both, I'm showing viewers this poll, YouGov poll. It's called Beyond Belief. Who do voters trust to tell the truth about the government's response to the coronavirus pandemic? You can see Boris Johnson 55%, not much or not at all, but they seem to trust Dominic Cummings even less. That's at 75%, not much or not at all. Should people take his word, Matthew?
I would. I suspect that there'll be a lot of truth in what he says. The fact that he's rather unpopular, and because of Barnard Castle and all that, people don't really want to listen to him. But I don't think it's going to make the splash that he hopes. I think the general feeling outside Westminster, anyway, is that it was all a terrible mess all around the world. Nobody knew quite what to do. Mistakes may have been made. But hell, we're all getting vaccinated now, and we move on. And so I think Dominic's contribution will be very useful for historians, but I doubt whether it's going to change the political weather.
Right. Well, Caroline, before you answer, Valerie has brought up Barnard Castle and eye test. Tomorrow is the anniversary of Dominic Cummings answering questions from the press in the Rose Garden, you may remember, at number 10 about that lockdown trip. But what's your view about how seriously we should take the evidence that he gives?
It's quite interesting that we've had this sort of previewing of his appearance before he sits in front of the Joint Committee later this week. I think, was it you said about tweets? I think we had 55 tweets and counting. Maybe that's going to start a trend for appearances at select committees. I sort of feel that outside of the Westminster bubble, this won't have as much impact as insiders, politicians and journalists might hope. That doesn't mean that the public aren't interested in what happened here in the past year, and there may be a time in which that will have more traction, I think. But at the moment, I think the general view is that whoever was in government, mistakes would have been made. Things didn't go well. The Eat Out to Help Out may have contributed to a rising of infections and led to the next lockdown. But on balance, I think the government are at the moment being given the benefit of the doubt. And of course, that's partly because the vaccination procurement and delivery programme has been so successful and is incredibly popular. So I think in terms of the wider public, there won't be as much interest in what happens later this week. It will totally dominate the insider political news agenda. Yes. But some of what Dominic Cummings says this week may have more traction on later views about how this whole pandemic has been handled in the UK.
Well, and of course the inquiry.
27,000 people have died. I know people directly who've lost loved ones. The
I lost my
mother-in-law. Are waiting.
Well, I lost my mother-in-law, Valerie.
Bereaved are waiting to hear from this. Caroline, I didn't interrupt you. The bereaved are waiting to hear from people. Dominic was at the right hand of the Prime Minister at the time, and remember, the Prime Minister was in hospital for a while. Not quite at death's door that we were led to believe, but he was there. And I think it's quite
an extraordinary thing to say.
I think it's quite important that we don't
way?
Forget the 127,000 people.
Simon?
I think. Sorry, I'll let Caroline come in.
Yes, Caroline, you respond.
I'll come in.
I hope, Valerie, there was nothing in what I said that would lead you to suggest that I was taking for granted the people who died, because I lost a very close relative, as did many other people. And I have to say, at the time, I switched off all the news because we were so distressed in our family about just listening to some of the information that was going on and our concern about our own care home experience. And this, what I said, doesn't take away at all from that. What I'm just trying to say is that I think from what I've listened to, particularly actually listening to voters over the last 2 months in my own area in terms of the contact we've had during the local elections, what's come back clearly is people are so focused on getting on with what they can do in terms of this pandemic, getting the vaccination. And also, I have to say, to a certain extent, giving the benefit of the doubt to the government and thinking who was ever in government would have found it a difficult time. That does not take away that down the road, when we get through this crisis and hopefully some normality comes back, that there will be more interrogation and the public will be maybe more interested in what's happened here and who should be held to account.
Simon, you wanted to respond to something else that Valerie said.
Really to say that I think it is genuinely wrong, Valerie, to question how sick the Prime Minister was. He was in intensive care and very, very ill. And I think we shouldn't allow that to pass without comment. That was simply wrong to say that. More broadly, I think Caroline speaks a lot of sense there. There is undoubtedly a widespread feeling among the population that the government has done its best, facing incredibly challenging circumstances, to make sure that we got through this crisis. In fact, we've now hit the 60 million doses of vaccine delivered, and the fact that the UK is now emerging as one of the best countries to be in at this point as we come out of the crisis. Yes. Of course there are lessons to be learned. The government's open about that. We've commissioned an inquiry, and that will report, and in the fullness of time, a properly balanced judgment can be formed.
Right. Valerie, do you want to take back what you said? I mean, there's no evidence, is there, that Boris Johnson wasn't seriously ill?
He was or he wasn't. I don't know. None of us were in the room.
Well,
none of us were in
intensive care, Valerie.
OK, so he was in intensive care. I don't know. I can't honestly. I'm not his doctor.
Well, but what's the point of saying that you're not sure?
I'm just saying people have died Dominic Cummings was at his right. And we're talking about Dominic Cummings giving evidence, aren't we?
We are.
So,
but you seem to imply that perhaps the Boris Johnson...
When the Prime Minister was in intensive care, and I don't know, I mean, honestly, I don't know, that's not the issue. The issue, he was there and running the government,
doubt on it,
and
Valerie.
he will have made judgment calls with or without the government, with or without the Prime Minister at the time. And yeah, quite frankly, the Prime Minister was actually left there. It was left to Carrie Simons to alert the medics to call on to look after the Prime Minister. But that's not the point. The point I'm making.
No, but why are you making it, Valerie? That's
the right hand of the Prime Minister at the time, making important decisions, and he was there. There are 127,000 people who have died, including Caroline's own.
And this discussion is demonstrating how sensitive it is. Matthew, you wanted to come back in.
Just standing aside from this little spat for a moment, it is not the case that the policy has ever been that the only priority was to minimise the number of deaths. It was a balance between keeping the economy a little bit open and keeping deaths down to the minimum consistent with that. So perfectly respectable people, for perfectly morally respectable reasons, many of them thought that we should accept a higher level of deaths, and others thought we should accept a lower level of deaths. And it isn't a matter of the government having the priority, the only priority, of stopping the pandemic spreading. You could have done that easily by just saying everyone must stay at home and no one must go to work, and it wouldn't have spread.
No, but there was huge controversy over this idea of herd immunity, and in fact I want to pick up with our political correspondent Chris Mason on the threads, one of the threads from Dominic Cummings about that very issue. The charge that's made, Chris, by Dominic Cummings on that, and the government's response that you've heard to some extent from Simon, and really we do know something about it. There was a sort of grey area in between.
Yeah, afternoon to you, Jo. What's fascinating here, I think, is when you get into the definition of exactly what might have been meant by that phrase, herd immunity, and what we know from what people said publicly, and what we also know from our journalistic endeavours around the conversations going on in March of last year, which Dominic Cummings has spoken to in quite some depth, as you've been reflecting in this 55-strong Twitter thread. So if we go back to last March, what do we know? We know that Sir Patrick Vallance, the government's chief scientific advisor, talked about, in his words, reducing the peak, broadening the peak, not suppressing it completely, also because the vast majority get a mild illness, building up a degree of herd immunity. We also know from Dr. David Halpern, who's the chief executive of the Behavioural Insights team, the Nudge Unit as it's sometimes known. He talked about the idea of herd immunity in the context of cocooning the most vulnerable and others being exposed to the virus. And we also know from Freedom of Information requests that were put in by the BBC looking at the emails between Sir Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty, England's chief medical officer, and others, using that phrase herd immunity prior to the first lockdown, that there was nervousness from Sir Patrick after he'd used the phrase in a round of interviews, and that perhaps the language needed to be altered. Yes, there was an acceptance that some would get the virus. Yes, there was an attempt to flatten the curve, flatten the sombrero, as the Prime Minister's language, I think, from the time, an acceptance that some would get it. Then you get into an argument about exactly what the idea of herd immunity actually is as a definition. And I guess that's going to be elaborated on by Mr. Cummings in a couple of days' time.
Chris Mason, thank you very much. I'm just going to show everybody this headline, this story in BBC News. Human rights body leaves Stonewall diversity scheme. This is the UK's human rights watchdog, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which has decided not to renew its membership of a diversity scheme run by the LGBT charity Stonewall. Now, we asked Stonewall for an interview, but no one was available. We're going to talk to Amru Al-Kadi, writer and performer and LGBT plus rights campaigner. Welcome to you, Amru. What do you make of the EHRC's decision?
There's two things I'd like to say here. Firstly, I think we should all not be too duped by the sort of supposed neutrality of the EHRC, seeing as a lot of its appointees are Tory appointed, and the current Tory government have a sort of pattern of sort of marking their own homework in terms of creating independent organisations like with the Race Report, and this current Tory government is an institutionally transphobic one. You know, Liz Truss rescinded the Gender Recognition Act last year, was attempting to legislate to exclude trans people from single-sex spaces. So there's just, I want to preface it by that.
But
the second thing, I think what it tells us is not something about Stonewall, but the alarming rate and momentum anti-trans movements in the UK and all around the world are getting. And Stonewall is really fending off sustained attacks. I'd like to give a few statistics. Firstly, this year alone, 223 articles in the Times and Sunday Times. This year alone, that's nearly 2 a day against trans people, none written by trans people, of course, all conducted with a sort of anti-trans cisgender agenda. Transgender people make up 0.6 to 1% of the population, which means that cisgender people make up 99% to 99.4%. And there are a wealth of anti-trans groups, geopolitically organized, funded by anti-abortion groups, anti-LGBT groups, and they're just gaining so much momentum. And I think this story, Stonewall are being scapegoated as some kind of trans Goliath, when the real sort of monsters on the ground, I'm afraid to say, are the anti-trans zealots, which are gaining political power.
All right. Well, let's put some of that, because we have a writer from the Times here, Matthew Parris. You wrote at the weekend, Matthew, that Stonewall, which you co-founded, should stay out of the trans war, as you put it. What did you mean exactly?
Well, exactly that. Stonewall was founded, I was one of the 14 founders, to advance the rights and interests of lesbian women and gay men. That was all about sexual attraction. It was about how the law was punishing what people did. The trans debate is completely different. It's about what people are, what people want to be, how people want to be recognized. It has nothing to do with sexual attraction. It's intensely controversial. It provokes huge emotions on all sides, and it shouldn't have Stonewall should have steered clear. They shouldn't have got into it. The trans people were not what they were formed to look at. I'm not taking any view on the debate on trans people. I'm simply saying that Stonewall shouldn't have been involved in this, and I think Stonewall have been sort of selling their services to certify, and it just doesn't seem to be the sort of organisation that Ian McKellen, Michael Cashman, many others, and I founded.
Right, Amru, you are looking sceptical, to say the least.
I mean, firstly, I think it's important to note that Stonewall was actually late in advocating for trans people. Actually, most LGBT organizations around the world have always advocated for trans people. And historically, the gay movement and trans movement have been really aligned. I'm slightly horrified because I did read your piece, Matthew, which sort of said, gay rights, good place, we can get married. Why are we getting engaged with the trans debate? You know, gay people and trans people, and many trans people can in fact be gay, have a lot of aligned struggles: access to proper healthcare, rejection from family, violation on the street, discrimination in the workplace. Those aligned struggles builds a coalition that can bring them together. Dividing them together, I think, helps no one besides the bad faith actors who are. So, and what I will also say is, if the largest queer charity in the UK was to essentially say, no, let's not help trans people, who are an intensely vulnerable population. And let's also be aware, there's not that many. That's maybe under 1%. They need as much support from LGBT organizations as possible.
Well, let Matthew respond then. I mean, where's the solidarity, Matthew?
Where's the empathy? Also, where's your empathy?
My empathy can be wherever my empathy is. Anybody's empathy can. The question is what Stonewall was founded to do. And there are many minorities in Britain who are oppressed or who feel resentful, who are fighting for their rights, and they're not necessarily bound up with sex or sexuality at all. Stonewall was there for lesbian women and gay men. And there are any number of minority causes. I can remember that quite a few people in the gay community got involved with the miners during the miners' strike because they felt here was another oppressed and misunderstood minority. That was inappropriate. A gay man or a lesbian woman has no particular insight into the difficulties, the problems, the struggles of trans people. And I don't think we should be involved.
All right, Amru, go on, just briefly, because I want to open it up to the rest of the panel.
So in the 80s, I wasn't around in the 80s, but, gay people in the media were really targeted by a kind of continued moral panic in the media, Section 28. That's exactly what's happening to trans people now. I mean, let's just be clear. There are no trans MPs. There's no trans columnists in major newspapers. It's all conducted with bad faith actors. Gay people who were victim to that kind of moral panic in the 80s have a lot in common with what trans people are suffering now. And it's called solidarity. And also it's slightly ignorant of trans and gay history to suggest that they were never aligned. The Gay Liberation Front back in the 70s and 80s, that had trans people right on the front line. The Stonewall riots had trans people. So this idea that it's always been separate is not right.
All right, there's a lot to unpack and respond to. There was one thing you said at the beginning, Amru, and stay with us, and Simon, you would probably like to respond, which is that the government is institutionally transphobic.
Which is absolutely and completely not true. This government is committed to making sure that everybody has the right to live the life that they want to lead, and that we protect all minority views to the very best extent possible under the law. The particular decision taken by the EHRC in this case does seem to be justified. Stonewall have made some quite serious mistakes that we saw on the screen in the captions just now about their advice to the University of Essex, which was found to be seriously flawed on this. But more broadly on this debate, I think it is important that we don't allow ourselves to lose sight of the fact that this is a question of balancing very sensitive rights. And so for every trans person who, for example, wants to use a woman's changing room, there are women who may feel very legitimately uncomfortable with that. And this is a debate where it does feel as though we are privileging identity issues all the time over the lived experience of many, many other people who, for very legitimate reasons, disagree. And I would count myself among them. So I think we do need to look at this very sensitively, and certainly not characterise the EHRC or the government as acting in bad faith, when in fact it's about trying to balance really sensitive and complex moral choices.
Valerie, what's your view? Amru, I'm going to come back to you at the end, but I just must get the others in as well. Valerie?
I think it's really upsetting to see two excellent organisations at loggerheads with each other in the fight for equality. I mean, I was a councillor when they had Section 28, and it was the most terrible time when I was a councillor in Ealing, and it's awful, and the fact is that we shouldn't have a hierarchy of equality. But I would just take slight offence to what Simon has said about we're still waiting for the ban on conversion therapies, which has only just been announced in the Queen's speech, but the government has promised that for the last 3 years. So things like that the government need to move much more quickly on that. But I think really it's a matter for those two organisations to decide which direction they go into. And as Matthew has said, it was about advice. It wasn't about, they weren't forced to take that advice. It was just advice.
Right. Well, in terms of that, actually, Caroline, other organisations like the Royal Navy, GCHQ, are all part of this scheme, the Diversity Champions programme by Stonewall. Are you comfortable with that?
No, I think it's reasonable for all those organisations to make that decision. And as far as I'm aware, the Equality and Human Rights Commission is still doing other work with Stonewall. I just want to go back to something that Matthew and Amal were saying earlier on. I think,
Amru.
I do understand. Sorry.
It's Amru. That's right.
Sorry, Amru. Sorry, Amru. I can't see you, so I can't see your name on the screen. It's Amru. Sorry about that. Is that I do understand that, in terms of today, the trans community are seeking support legally and otherwise, and facing many of the same barriers in a way that the gay community did in the 80s and before. I think in this sort of area, it's where some of the rows that have been had are still issues to be resolved between the protection of sex inequality law and advancing trans rights. And that's a space I just wish we could have more discussion on, because I think social media has in many respects driven very hard corners in this debate, which I think have been completely unhelpful. And I think there's so much more we could talk about where we can find common cause. And it's sad that, obviously there are rows like the one that's erupted over this that have added to the tensions.
Amru?
I still feel there's a way through this for us to come to some sort of sense of common purpose.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I think there's two things to say here. Firstly, the statistics on the ground, I think what we're seeing on social media and in the media more general doesn't actually reflect that the majority of women, especially younger generations, are broadly supportive of trans rights, which is really encouraging. There's YouGov polls about this. But this question that I think Simon raised about balancing the rights, trans people currently don't have a voice in these conversations. You know, as I mentioned, there are no transgender MPs, there are no trans columnists in any major newspapers. I mean, they are being kept out of the conversation in a really, really major way. And as a result, it's being conducted by people who can't speak for that experience. And and as I mentioned, you know, your paper, for instance, 223 articles this year about trans people, not one written by a trans person.
All right.
So I just think it's not a fair fight. And to pretend that trans people are the kind of majority party here when they just make up less than 1%.
Well, I don't think anyone's pretending that they're the majority party, but I take your point. Amru, thank you very much for joining us. Now, the main law for the control of drugs is 50 years old this week. The question is it working? Here's Jack Fenwick.
Looking back, I don't think either my husband or I realised how much danger he was in.
Pat's son Kevin died in 2017 after injecting heroin.
He was in a locked toilet, so no one noticed, and certainly no one got to him in time to give him CPR. 2 days later, in hospital after a scan, it was the news was broken to us that his brain was fatally damaged, and so we had to make the decision to turn off his life support system.
Kevin Lane was 32 at the time and worked as a tree surgeon.
I would call him a functioning heroin addict for perhaps 10 years before he died. He held down a job, he was skilled, he did evening classes in art, he was articulate, very popular, fun-loving, much loved by his family.
Pat believes current drug policies aren't working.
One of the problems with the Misuse of Drugs Act, indeed, is that it fixes in society, and has done for half a century, the fact that you are doing something illegal. The stigma of illegality prevents young people seeking help. Drug policies are killing our young people rather than the drugs themselves.
Pat and her husband Tony decided to bury Kevin in a field near their home.
My whole purpose in campaigning for drug policy reform is to try to prevent, you know, a senseless death like Kevin's happening to some other young man or woman and the parents and family, where so many suffer from just one death.
So what would you like to see changed?
Well, first of all, decriminalisation of all drugs for possession for personal use only.
It's been 50 years since the Misuse of Drugs Act was introduced, and campaigners like Pat are now calling for change. But here in Westminster, that's not the predominant view.
Of course people do drugs. There are lots of things that are illegal that people do. If it wasn't the case, we wouldn't have any police officers or we wouldn't have speeding cameras. But there's undoubtedly a deterrent as well. If something is illegal, there is a deterrent. You're never going to get a perfect drug policy. That is an impossibility. But I don't think there is a huge appetite amongst politicians, and I'm not sure there's a huge appetite amongst the public to do much more on drugs.
Around 50 MPs and peers believe the Misuse of Drugs Act needs changing. They say new laws could prevent deaths, cut crime, and improve medical research.
In 1971, we had 1,049 registered heroin addicts. We then stopped people being able to get a prescription from their doctor, having got themselves in a mess with their addiction. And 20 years later, we had 350,000. It's a policy of total madness by abandoning what was called the British system in the 1960s and going for this approach of prohibition. But what we've also done is fail to develop medicines from substances like cannabis and the psychedelics simply because of their reputation, nothing to do with the medical evidence.
The big decisions on UK drug policy are largely made here at the Home Office. We asked them for an interview, but they declined. Instead, they said that drugs devastate lives and communities and that legalisation would send the wrong message to the vast majority of people who do not take drugs.
Matthew, I mean, you heard the moving testimony there from Pat, talking about the tragic death of her son, Kevin. Where do you actually come down in this debate? Do you think the current law is working, or that the government should look again, Parliament should look again at decriminalising or even legalising some drugs?
Well, yes, we did hear about Kevin, and we heard, I think the last MP was Crispin Blunt.
It was.
Suggesting that in the days when heroin could be obtained on prescription, if you were a registered drug addict, there were far fewer heroin users. I agree with Crispin. I think that heroin addicts and certain other extremely addictive drugs, people ought to be treated as patients of the NHS rather than treated as criminals and who get their stuff on the street. But B, I don't agree with Crispin that that's necessarily going to result in fewer people taking heroin. I have seen the damage that drugs have done. I know people who have been, I think, irredeemably damaged. I've been to Rotterdam in Holland, where you can get your heroin, get your drugs in a government-recognised injection centre. But they still have a problem with drugs in Holland, and we would still have a problem with drugs in Britain. And the idea either that these drugs are not all that harmful, or that people would stop using them or use them less if we were to decriminalise, I don't support. I support decriminalisation because I think in the end that we all choose our own path to the everlasting bonfire. But okay, don't pretend that drugs aren't very, very dangerous.
Right. Well, Caroline, what's your view? Because you've had some experience of changing the law on drugs. You were a minister at the Home Office when the last Labour government downgraded cannabis from a Class B to a Class C drug in 2004. What was the thinking behind the decision?
The thinking behind that decision, Jo, was on two counts. One was about police time. A lot of police time was spent dealing with arrests around cannabis rather than focusing on Class A drugs like heroin, where their time should have been better spent. The other part of it was coupled with a whole programme aimed at education information, particularly for young people, around the use of drugs, cannabis being one of them. And I have to say the third part of it was we introduced a drug intervention programme that focused very much on how the police could work with the health services and the voluntary sector to try and identify and get people into treatment. And Matthew's absolutely right. This is not a perfect area of policy by any stretch. But the idea that by decriminalising or making drugs legal, that would stop people getting addicted is just not the case. My view has always been that if we, for example, legitimise heroin use and made it legal, then government would have to find some way of making sure it was sold in the right way or prescribed in the right way. And organised crime would always then step in to top up whatever limits the government set. And the world we live in today is way different from 1971. Organised crime has morphed into a way in terms of drug cartels and everything else that was unimaginable back then. So I don't think the way Crispin sees this and the causes for the expansion of drug use and drug addiction is just down to stopping prescribing heroin on a script.
Right. I mean, Valerie, what's your view in terms of we're looking at deaths from drug poisoning and drugs in general? Does it need to be reformed? Does the law need to be changed and adapted?
So our view, the Labour Party view, is that we don't want to change the legal framework, but what we do want to do is to reduce harm. And we think it's a public health issue.
How?
And so, for example, the former Police and Crime Commissioner in the West Midlands worked out that it costs £1.4 billion as a cost to society as a whole, the people who have, lose their jobs and the petty crime. And he was looking at drug consumption rooms, as they have done in Switzerland and in Frankfurt, as a way of reducing that. So that's a public health issue. And I think they looked at that in Portugal as well. And there are many reasons why people end up in taking drugs, and that's what we need to look at. We need to look at ways of helping people come off the drugs, and by looking at it as a public health issue, I think is the way forward.
Right. If we go back to the film, though, Simon, with the mother there, Pat, saying that it isn't working. It's drugs policy, not drugs, that, in her view, are killing people like her son. Let's just show our viewers and our other guests these statistics. Deaths related to drug poisoning in England. You can see that in 2009, there were 2,675 deaths related to drug poisoning in England. And then in 2019, the numbers have risen significantly so that there were 4,115 deaths related to it. So the approach isn't working, is it, by the government?
Well, I think every one of those deaths is a tragedy, but the idea that decriminalisation is the solution is not one that I share. I think we need to go after the gangs who sell this stuff, who cause such misery. Drugs devastate communities. We see that right across the United Kingdom, particularly in Scotland, where the SNP record is just so terrible. But right across the country, this is a major social challenge. We do not, I'm afraid to say, break the cycle by decriminalising and sending a message it's okay.
This is a 10-year increase. You mention Scotland and the SNP, and we have talked to the SNP about it. You're right, Scotland's drug deaths problem is bigger than the one in England, but it's not great, is it, in England? And would you agree, then, if you think the SNP is responsible in Scotland, then obviously your government is responsible in England?
We are, of course we're responsible in England, and we want to make sure that we crack down on the gangs that sell this stuff. And I think we need to go hard at the idea that taking drugs is a consequence-free act. The curse of middle-class drug taking as well is a major problem. It's one that we need to stigmatise. These substances are socially harmful. They cause harm in a way which ripples right across society, and we do need, I think, to send a very clear message, of anything, to get tougher on drugs rather than liberalising.
Right. I mean, Matthew, you heard Charles Walker, also a Conservative MP in the film, saying that the current laws do deter people from taking drugs and that there isn't a big appetite across Parliament to change the law. Do you think that's right?
I think he's right about the fact that there isn't a big appetite to change the law. I don't think most people think the law is working very well, but nobody really knows what should replace it. That appears to be the problem. It's the involvement, the tangling up of drug taking with the criminal world, which has done so much damage, an enormous amount of damage, and an awful lot of theft and robbery is just for people desperate to get the money to buy the drugs that they desperately want. I have a feeling that gradual medicalisation, combined with gradual decriminalisation, might ameliorate the difficulties for the whole of society, but I do not kid myself that it will cause less people to take drugs, or that drugs will become less dangerous.
All right, I'm going to show you this headline in The Guardian, because today's news out is that Jo Cox's sister has been selected as the Labour candidate for Batley and Spen by-election. I think we can show you some pictures of Jo Cox's sister, Kim Leadbeater, who is now Labour's candidate. Her sister, of course, was murdered while carrying out her constituency work because she was the former MP in 2015. The by-election has come about because Tracy Brabin, Labour MP, has become the West Yorkshire mayor. Caroline, just how critically important for Keir Starmer and Labour is it to win this by-election?
It's very important, and I'm glad to see they haven't made the same mistake as Hartlepool with a shortlist of one. I think it was a shortlist of 3, and over 80% of the members voted for Kim. And I think she is I've only had one conversation with Kim before, and it was around a few years back on social media abuse. She seems a very sensible, common sense person whose charity work speaks for itself about trying to bring people together. And of course, she's Batley and Spen through and through. So I wish her all the best in the by-election.
Right. What do you think went wrong in Hartlepool then, Caroline?
Well, I think choosing a candidate in Hartlepool who was very much tied up with the People's Vote campaign when he was an MP for Stockton South was a mistake.
Right. I mean, Valerie, you lost your job as shadow leader of the House in the wake of the Hartlepool by-election and election results for the Labour Party. Why?
I know, I did. I think that's one of the reasons that was cited, but I'm not quite sure. I love the people of Hartlepool. I don't know what I've done to deserve it, but anyway, I was removed from my post along with the Chief Whip, Nick Brown. But I think I'm really pleased that Kim has been selected. She's a doughty fighter. You can't take away the fact that it's going to be really difficult for her anyway, having to follow in her sister's footsteps in that way in such a difficult by-election. I mean, it is. We all remember where we were when Jo was shot, and the news was coming through that we didn't know what was happening to her until much later that she died. But I wish Kim all the very, very best, and we'll all be there to help her. I think it's going to be a different by-election. I think we've learnt some lessons. I have to say, Paul Williams...
What lessons have you learnt?
Paul Williams, I just want to touch on Paul Williams. He was an excellent colleague. He was a doctor that was actually vaccinating people. I don't think his other politics came into it, but for some reason our message didn't come across. We didn't cut through. I don't know what it was, but it didn't, and our message didn't. And you can see the polls. I'm not shying away from the polls that we're at 28%, but we are going to listen to what people have to say. And I think we're going to put the economy at the centre. We've got a very important amendment that we're putting down to the financial bill today, which is about corporation tax, which I think the government haven't signed up to, which Joe Biden, President of the United States, and all the other G7 countries have signed up to, but the government hasn't, 21% minimum. And we want to make sure that people like Amazon, who paid corporation tax of, say, 61 billion compared to Marks and Spencer's, which was 3.3 billion. So you can see the difference. We've got to make sure that we close the loopholes on tax evasion and tax avoidance.
Right. And
that's today.
So Labour...
And I hope people will hear that message, that we are going to make sure that the economy is front and centre. And
so if Labour's going to put the economy front and centre, this is going to be a different battle, isn't it, Batley and Spen by-election to Hartlepool?
I think the fact that Valerie was scapegoated for the, along with Nick Brown, was scapegoated for the defeat in Hartlepool says a lot about the extent to which Labour have actually learned the lessons of the Hartlepool by-election, which is to say that they haven't at all. And, Valerie says, I don't know why the message didn't come through. I'll tell you why it didn't come through. It's because Labour have talked down to communities like Hartlepool for years. They've ignored them on Brexit. They've ignored them on a wide range of social values, while the Conservatives are talking about levelling up opportunity, actually delivering on the ground. In Hartlepool, of course, we had a spectacular example of that in the form of the Tees Valley Mayor, Ben Houchen. It's about actually moving the country forward. We talk about the economy, but it's the Conservatives who are actually delivering a real plan to rebuild after COVID, talking positively to northern communities who have been, I'm afraid, totally taken for granted for Labour for a generation or more. And that's why things have gone wrong.
I agree with that, Simon, actually, because Tracy Braben actually won in the same area. And so we've got our first woman Metro Mayor. We've got Preston, we won. We didn't lose a single seat.
Valerie, if you're trying to redeem those results is good. They were terrible.
The Metro Mayor in Salford we've done
a lot on the election and the election results as on this programme endlessly. But Matthew, listening to what Simon Clarke said about levelling up, you have written something that actually disputes that. This Conservative government is not going to level up Red Wall England. That is the lie at the heart of the new populist Tory appeal. Why do you disagree?
The scope that there is through government action to do any sort of levelling up, which will show really visible results within a couple of years, is almost zero. And I don't expect that the high street in Hartlepool or Mansfield or anywhere else is going to look very different in 2 or 3 years' time from what it does now. So that promise of levelling up, I think, is rather cynical. But I think the reason for this gradual swing away from Labour to the Conservatives in these areas isn't really because anyone has believed the promises of levelling up. No one thinks the government can do that kind of thing. It's a real change. It's a change in the loyalties that the automatic loyalty that hundreds of thousands, millions of people in the Midlands and the North had for Labour. That's gone, and they won't get it back. Simon, I think to win the Batley and Spen by-election would save Keir Starmer's leadership. And, being a little cynical, I think choosing the sister of a murdered woman as your candidate was an extremely shrewd choice.
Right. Well, Simon, he doesn't believe in levelling up. Why do you?
I believe in levelling up because I'm seeing it in my own part of the world. So we talked about Hartlepool, and in the Tees Valley, we've got a really exciting series of announcements based around the Treasury coming to Darlington. You've got the new Freeport at T-Sport, which has already secured over 2,000 jobs in that area. And this is a good example of how actually on the ground real change is happening. It won't all be delivered by government.
I'm going to give Caroline, you've got 10 seconds to end the show. Caroline?
Levelling up is only going to count when it means something to people on the ground. When people say back to you, this is how my life's improved, that's when you know you've won or not. And Labour has to make sure it's listening to those people.
Thank you to all of you from all of us here. Bye-bye.